It was almost 1 year ago when I first got my hands on the Panasonic GH6 and immediately began putting it through a series of tests and shoots all over the world. Since that day, one thing has remained constant. Power and features this camera has for the price is absolutely insane. So this is the Panasonic GH6, and it is still one of the most incredible cameras you can buy today. And I'm talking 5.7K at 60 frames per second, 4K up to 120, and then 300 frames per second in 1080p. So I've got the keys to this Rolls-Royce Ghost, so we're gonna take these out and see if this is still worth picking up in 2023.
Now let's be honest, I do think Panasonic is facing just a bit of an uphill battle with the GH6, just because it uses a fairly small micro four thirds sensor, while pretty much every other camera out there, including like the Panasonic S5 and S1, use a much larger sensor. I mean, going from a full frame camera to this, it's a pretty major difference.
Now, a little bit of perspective. If you've been shooting video as long as I have, you'll remember those video cameras with like 1/4 inch and 1/3 inch sensors. So by that perspective, this is absolutely huge. The question is if Panasonic loaded the GH6 with enough features to really justify moving to this smaller sensor.
So probably the first two things that people worry about with micro four thirds is going to be low light and dynamic range, since these smaller sensors get less light. Now Panasonic has tackled this with a dual gain sensor for better low light performance and a dynamic range boost mode, which is basically using that dual gain sensor to take two frames, one at the base ISO and another at a higher ISO, and combine them for better dynamic range, which they say gets you over 13 stops in vlog, or at least that's what they claim.
So I'm actually turning this dynamic range boost on, and I can see it making a pretty big difference. I mean, right here, I have kind of the worst case scenario. I have the super bright sky and the car is in the shade, and I need every bit of dynamic range that I can get. Now, do keep in mind this will default to 2000 ISO, and it only works in vlog, but if you really need that extra little bit of highlight room, you can get it using this dynamic range boost.
Now back on the computer, I put dynamic range boost shots next to the standard shots, and yeah, you can absolutely notice the difference. Basically, I'm seeing about one stop, mostly on the highlights, of extra room before it clips, maybe even a little bit more. And so even with shots that are around like +3 EV or pretty overexposed when I was shooting them, I'm still getting a perfectly usable exposure with that boost mode on, which is pretty insane, especially when you consider this is a micro four thirds sensor. And I'm also gonna say that, look, dynamic range, it's a number, but in real life, I just feel like I'm able to pull a bit more from this sensor because Panasonic's V-Log, which is their log profile, which is included with this camera actually, is just so much easier for me to get a good look from compared to a lot of other cameras on the market. And Panasonic also has this flat profile, which if you're not used to grading log, but still want a little bit of extra room in post to grade, the colors in that mode are just insane. The highlight roll off is very smooth, and I just end up with a better image than some other cameras that claim a little bit more dynamic range from the sensor itself. Now the dual gain on this hits at about ISO 2000, so that's really where that low light sweet spot is on the GH6. And testing this in low light, I have shots on this at 3200 ISO and even 6400 ISO that are still usable. And back with like the GH5, I couldn't really push that over 1600 ISO without quite a bit of noise. So yeah, this isn't like quite full frame low light performance, but is getting so much better. And there's another big feature on this that might close that gap in low light quite a bit more.
Now last week I did take the GH6 to Tokyo, Japan, and what's almost ironic is you guys know I love a gimbal, but we were advised against using them in the city, so I left it alone, and the GH6 is just one of those few cameras that the in-body image stabilization is so good, you can shoot this thing handheld all day long. And honestly, I thought the GH5 IBIS was amazing, but this system in the GH6 is just even better, and it seems to handle natural movement in video so much more smoothly than pretty much any other camera out there.
So originally I kind of thought that that smaller sensor was a bit of a weakness, but Actually, there are quite a few advantages, and probably the best is that you can basically adapt any lens from any brand to this camera. There is an adapter from Micro Four Thirds to pretty much every lens mount in existence, and because this sensor is actually smaller than most other cameras, those lenses cover more than the sensor. And a little bonus, you're actually shooting through the center of the lens, which is the best quality portion of that lens. So I find that pretty much all of my lenses look a little bit better on this camera. Plus, you can always use speed boosters if you want to enlarge that sensor area for some shallower depth of field. And that smaller sensor helps keep rolling shutter very controlled. It helps the camera process some really fast frame rates. And those are some serious advantages, like real life stuff. Now, Panasonic is also historically amazing with keeping things updated via firmware. And in the past few months, they've actually added a bunch of new stuff to this. So we have Apple ProRes recording modes. We have raw video via HDMI at the full 5.7K resolution, and SSD recording over USB. So instead of using the SD or CF Express cards, which the GH6 has both of those, you can go straight USB-C out to an SSD external. So you can hold terabytes of footage on those for a couple $100, which is awesome. But one thing has really changed my perspective on this camera, and it is these two new lenses that I have been shooting with, the 10 through 25 millimeter and the 25 through 50. And remember, Panasonic has a 2x crop. So this takes you from 20 millimeters to 100 millimeters, which is the focal lengths I use the most. And both of these lenses have a constant aperture of 1.7. So it's literally like almost 2 stops more light and shallower depth of field than like a standard f2.8 zoom. So basically, if I wanted zooms on all other cameras, you'd pretty much be stuck at f2.8. But on the GH6, you have 1.7 aperture zoom. So that helps to bring back some of that shallow depth of field and low light performance that you would typically lose on these smaller sensor cameras. But we have to talk about the hardware of this camera because it is simply on another level from what you've typically seen. So this camera, it is built like a tank and built for video. So it feels absolutely amazing. You have so much customization on it. And just to give you an example, you actually have 3 buttons that you can use for start, stop recording, including one on the front, which is really nice to have. Plus you have a tally lamp on it so you can actually know when you're recording. And this flip screen here is really awesome because it also has a tilt functionality in it. So if you want to keep the camera kind of right in front of you and keep that tilt mode activated, you can. But also this helps clear some of those ports. So if you got the screen out like this, you just tilt this out and all of a sudden you have a lot of room on that side. But also this camera is really built to withstand temperatures that other cameras don't. And I'm not talking about like crazy deserts or anything. I live in the middle of Florida and I still overheat just about every camera that I shoot with in weddings in the summer here. And the GH6 has active cooling on it and still gives me unlimited recording, and it does it all without overheating the sensor. Now spec-wise, it's actually pretty insane what you get on this, and that's even if you forget the fact that this camera is right now on sale for under $2,000. So you have 5.7K at 60 frames per second, which I think I need to say again, this is just shy of 6K recording, even with slow motion. Plus, you can actually record in a 4:3 aspect ratio. So if you're shooting things like anamorphic, or if you just want to have some more vertical space, so if you want to be able to reframe in post or be able to go vertical in post. Plus, you can shoot in MP4, MOV, you get Apple ProRes, and you even get all eye recording at up to 800 megabits per second. And all of this is in camera. Plus, you get raw video output over HDMI. And this uses the HDMI 2.1 spec. So if you find a recorder that's fast enough, you can actually output at 4K 120 frames per second, which is insane. And this camera just has a ton of professional tools for nailing your color, your focus, and your exposure, basically things that you would only find in high-end cinema cameras. Now, if you watch my initial hands-on with this camera, there was one area where the GH6 it did struggle, and that's with continuous autofocus. So what's interesting here is that point-to-point autofocus is insanely fast if you have good light, and the GH6 has some of the best manual focus tools on any camera. But if you do want continuous autofocus, it can be a struggle. It's not quite a lost cause. Panasonic actually gives you a ton of control over the AF system. So adjusting that for each case, that's absolutely going to help. Plus you can actually set like a near and far limit to the autofocus system. So that'll prevent it from like accidentally focusing on the background. But this system is dependent on contrast, so just keep that in mind if you decide to use it, and you'll need decent lighting to really increase that hit rate. And the reality is, even in 2023, the GH6, it's still incredible for videographers at this price because it matches insane frame rates and resolution with incredible hardware, video-centric features, unlimited recording, and so many cinema lens options. And for me, this raises another question. If Panasonic is so far ahead when it comes to creating just an amazing camera for video, what would happen if they ever added phase detection autofocus to one of their cameras? I mean, I'm just curious, but what do you think that would actually look like?